At 11:47 a.m. on November 29, 1943, a 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin was alone in the last 10 feet of a dying airplane. Not the cockpit, not the radio room, not the waist, the tail. He was crouched behind the twin .50 caliber Brownings in a B-17F called Rikki Tikki Tavi, and the sky over Bremen was full of black flak bursts, those ugly, blooming bruises of smoke that looked slow until you remembered what they really were. Razor fragments thrown through air at the speed of a rifle bullet. A second ago, Eugene Moran had been part of a vast moving city of aluminum, 300 bombers in formation, each one with a crew of 10, each one believing in the same fragile math. Altitude plus speed plus guns plus God equals a chance. Then the math collapsed. A concussion hit the airframe like a fist the size of a house. The intercom went dead. The fortress shuddered, lurched, and began to slide backward out of formation like a wounded animal being peeled away from the herd. Eugene's world, normally loud with engines and voices, became a vacuum. And then, with a sound like the universe ripping a seam, the airplane broke. The entire tail section, the stabilizers, the rudder, the tail wheel, the narrow tunnel Eugene had crawled through 100 times, sheared away from the fuselage. And Eugene Moran, tail gunner, was still inside it. No parachute, no crew, no manual. Just a severed tail falling from 20,000 feet into Germany. German fighters circled above the wreckage, confident the job was done. They were all wrong, because the tail section was still alive, and Eugene Moran's hands were still on the guns. And he made a decision that defied every survival instinct the human body has ever had. He kept firing. The mission had started 4 hours earlier at RAF Snetterton Heath in England. Before sunrise, before courage, before fear. There was only routine. Boots on cold concrete, breath hanging in the air, ground crew moving like shadows under floodlights, coffee that tasted like burned water, a briefing room with maps, red strings, and the kind of calm voices that made you forget you were about to fly into a machine designed to erase you. Eugene Moran was 19. That number matters because at 19 you still believe your life is long. At 19 you still think you can outwork fate. You still think fear is something you can swallow and keep down if you don't let it touch your eyes. He'd grown up on a farm in Wisconsin, a place where the horizon was wide and the problems were honest. Weather, hay, repairs, livestock. You did the work, you fixed the thing, you went to sleep. You could understand your world. Europe was not understandable. Europe was an equation written in smoke. This was his 5th mission. 5th, not 50th. Not a veteran with a tally of miracles and funerals inside his skull. 5th. The crew of Rikki Tikki Tavi moved through pre-flight like men trying not to look at the fact that the last few weeks had been a slaughterhouse for bombers over Germany. Bremen's defenses had a reputation that circulated through every mess hall and barracks like a ghost story. 64 bombers lost in the previous month, the whispers said. 11 tail gunners gone from the group since September, another voice would add. Like counting out loud could make it less real. Tail gunner was a lonely job. Everyone on a B-17 was confined. Everyone breathed the same oil fumes and cold oxygen, but the tail gunner was separated by design. At the end of the airplane, away from the cockpit, away from help, away from comfort, surrounded by thin metal and glass. If something went wrong in the tail, you handled it. If you couldn't handle it, you died back there, and the crew flew on with an empty position and a cold space where your voice used to be. Eugene strapped in anyway, because that's what you did. He told himself the same lie every bomber crew told itself. We'll be fine if we stay in formation. Formation was safety. Formation was doctrine. Formation was the thin line between order and panic. They lifted off with hundreds of other fortresses, climbing in long spirals over the English countryside until they formed a sky-high highway of bombers, each one a moving fortress with a crew of 10 and a prayer it didn't speak aloud. When they crossed the German coast, they were at 23,000 feet. The air outside was a killing cold. Inside the airplane, it was still cold, just a different kind. Metal doesn't care about bodies. It steals heat the way the ocean steals swimmers. Eugene checked his guns. He checked his ammo. He checked his oxygen. He did what he could control because everything else belonged to chance and enemy math. He scanned the sky. 6 o'clock was his responsibility. Behind them, under them, that invisible, hungry angle where fighters came in like knives. And then the first wave hit. The enemy arrived the way predators do. Fast, confident, practiced. Messerschmitt Bf-109s dropped from above, their noses angled down, their wings flashing in sunlight like blades. Eugene saw one closing at 6 o'clock, and his body moved before his mind finished the thought. Training, muscle memory, the mechanical certainty of a job you could do even when your hands were numb and your heart was trying to climb out of your throat. He squeezed the triggers. The Brownings hammered. The sound wasn't like a movie. It wasn't clean. It was a violent, stuttering roar that traveled through his arms and into his teeth. Brass casings clattered and bounced and rolled, filling the narrow space around his boots like coins spilled from a ruptured bank. The fighter rolled away, whether hit or simply avoiding the stream of traces. Eugene didn't know. In the air, you rarely knew what you'd done. You fired, the enemy moved, and you survived the next second if you were lucky. But then the sky changed, because fighters were one kind of danger. Flak was another. Flak didn't dogfight you. Flak didn't care about your skill. Flak didn't react to fear. Flak simply occupied a piece of sky and turned it into a wall of shrapnel. Black bursts began to appear around the formation, puffs that looked harmless until you understood each one was a timed explosion. A shell would burst in the air and scatter fragments in a sphere, each fragment slicing through aluminum and flesh with obscene precision. Eugene felt impacts, hard hits that made the airplane tremble. Then another, then another. Somewhere forward, the intercom crackled and then died entirely. No voices, no calls, no calm pilot, no navigator, no engineer, just the engines and the wind and the sound of the guns. Through the tail window, Eugene watched Rikki Tikki Tavi begin to drift backward out of formation. That moment, sliding away, is what bomber crews feared the way sailors fear losing sight of the convoy. Because the moment you were out of formation, you were alone, and the sky was full of things that hunted a lone aircraft. German fighters swarmed. Cannon rounds struck the fuselage with a heavy, tearing sound. The fortress shuddered again. Eugene returned fire. He tried to track shapes that moved too fast to hold. He watched wing flashes, glimpses, black crosses and glinting canopies, and then a massive explosion. The airplane jolted so hard, Eugene's head snapped. Forward, the nose section disappeared in flame, gone in a single, incomprehensible second, as if someone had simply erased the front half of the world. The bombardier, the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, the navigator's compartment, gone or burning or both. Eugene couldn't see, couldn't know. He only knew the intercom stayed dead. And then there was another hit. Somewhere in the waist, another shell tore through. The radio compartment became a place of death. Eugene didn't hear screams. At that altitude, with engines screaming, you didn't always hear anything. You just felt the airplane get lighter in the worst possible way. And then, in the silence of the intercom and the chaos of the sky, Eugene realized something that made his blood go cold. He might be the last man in the airplane. He forced himself to breathe, oxygen hissing into his mask, the rhythm of survival. He grabbed his parachute, and that was when the universe offered him the cruelest joke of all. The parachute was shredded. Bullet holes peppered the silk canopy, harness straps torn. The pack looked like it had been in a fight with a machine gun and lost. Eugene stared at it, waiting for reality to change. It didn't. No parachute. No escape. Only a narrow hatch that might have been jammed by the damage, and a tailgun position that was now, suddenly, less like a job and more like a coffin. He tried to move. Then the hit that changed everything arrived. A direct flak strike. The sound was beyond loud. It was an event. It filled his skull and his chest. It made the metal around him ring like a bell. and the airplane broke. There are moments in combat where time slows. People say that like it's poetic, like it's some gift. It isn't a gift. It's your brain trying to survive by taking more snapshots per second. Eugene felt the lurch, the sudden drop as gravity reclaimed him. The entire tail assembly broke free from the fuselage, and for a fraction of a second there was a sensation of weightlessness, as if the world had forgotten which way was down. Then down returned, hard. He was falling, still inside the tail section, 20,000 feet above Germany. No parachute, no way out. And yet, he didn't plunge straight down. The severed tail did something strange. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers, those great fin-like surfaces designed to keep a plane steady, became accidental wings. They caught air, they resisted descent, they created lift and drag and an unplanned kind of flight. The tail section began to glide, not gracefully. It spun. Slow at first, then steadier, as if the wreckage had found a horrible rhythm. A spinning glider, a metal capsule rotating through freezing air. Eugene's body was pressed against the bulkhead by centrifugal force. His neck muscles fought the spinning. His teeth rattled. The altimeter still worked. It was a small detail, but it mattered because it gave him a countdown, a visible measure of how much time he had left. He looked outside. German fighters circled above. They assumed everyone was dead, because a B-17 with its nose blown off and its fuselage torn open didn't usually produce survivors. But Eugene was alive, and his gun still worked. And in that moment, with the world rotating and the ground an invisible threat far below, he saw a fighter swoop past, close enough to see its shape, close enough to imagine the pilot's face behind the glass. Eugene Moran aimed. He fired. Tracers arced out into the sky from a tail section that shouldn't have existed as a fighting platform anymore. The German fighter banked away, startled, instinctively avoiding a threat that had no right to be a threat. Eugene kept firing, not because he thought he would win, not because he thought he would live, but because it was the only thing left that felt like he still had control over something. He was falling toward Germany. If he was going to die, he was going to die doing his job. The tail section continued its bizarre descent, spinning, gliding, shuddering in the air. And the altimeter kept dropping. 19,000, 18, 16. The numbers were relentless. The cold was absolute. The wind screamed past torn metal. Eugene's head slammed against the gun sight as the tail section rotated through turbulence. Pain flashed behind his eyes. He tasted blood. He tightened his grip and refused to let go, because letting go meant there was nothing else to do except wait. And waiting in a falling coffin is the purest form of terror. 15,000, 14. He tried the escape hatch. An instinctive act, the same way drowning people claw at water. It wouldn't budge. The frame was warped. He was locked in. 12,000, 11. The spin pressed him sideways. He could feel the aircraft's structure flexing and groaning. Aluminum skin peeling away in strips. 10,000. 9. The trees below, still distant but now visible as a dark texture on the world, began to separate into individual shapes. At this point in a normal bailout, you'd be under canopy, drifting. You'd be watching the ground get bigger with a kind of detached fear. Eugene was not drifting. He was descending in a rotating wreckage with no ability to steer, no ability to slow, and no way to stop the final collision. 8,000. 7. The glide flattened slightly, just enough to feel the stabilizers biting at the air. It was not mercy. It was physics. And physics sometimes looks like mercy until you realize it has no intention behind it at all. 6,000. 5. Eugene braced himself as best he could. He tried to wedge his boots. He tried to press his shoulder against a frame member. He tried to prepare his body for something no body is designed to endure. 4,000. 3. The forest outside a small town south of Bremen rose up. Pines like spears, branches like hands. 2,000. 1. The impact came without warning. The tail section hit the tops of the pine trees first. And that detail matters. Because the difference between dying instantly and living long enough to be found can be measured in feet and branches and angles. Wood snapped. Branches exploded. Metal screamed. The tail cartwheeled through the canopy, shedding pieces of aluminum skin like shrapnel. A stabilizer caught on a thick trunk and the whole wreckage pivoted, slowing, tearing, rotating in a violent tumble. Then it hit the ground. The impact drove Eugene into the gun sight. There are injuries you don't feel right away in moments like this. The brain is too busy keeping you alive. Eugene felt pain like white light. His arms went numb. His chest refused to expand normally. He was alive, and that was the strangest thought he would ever have. I'm still here. He tried to move. His body answered with nothing but agony. He couldn't see clearly. Something was running into his eyes. Blood, maybe, or rain, or both. His hearing was muffled. Then he heard voices. Not English. German. Footsteps crunching through forest litter. He tried to lift the guns again. By reflex, his arms didn't respond. Two figures appeared through the wreckage. Men in tattered clothing, not uniforms. They approached cautiously, as if expecting a body. They found a boy, barely conscious, drenched in blood and shock and impossible survival. They spoke to each other quickly, urgently. Eugene didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He's alive. They moved like people with training, like men who had handled injuries before. Later, Eugene would learn who they were. Prisoners forced into labor nearby. Among them, two men who had once been doctors. Men who had been captured and dragged into a war that wasn't theirs, now kneeling beside the wreckage of an American bomber tail and trying to keep a stranger's breathing steady with nothing but their hands and strips of cloth. They worked fast. They stabilized his head as best they could. They bound his arms. They applied pressure where they could. And then, within minutes, German soldiers arrived. Rifles raised, boots on needles and branches. The soldiers surrounded the crash site and looked down into the tail section. At Eugene, a tail gunner who should have been dead. The soldiers lowered their weapons, not out of kindness, but because there was no threat here. Only a broken boy and a broken piece of airplane. Orders were barked. A stretcher appeared. Eugene was lifted, carefully, brutally, out of the wreckage. As they carried him through the trees, the sky above was empty now. The battle had moved on. Only the aftermath remained. And Eugene Moran, who had fired from a falling tail section, was becoming something else. A prisoner, a witness, a problem that the German war machine had not planned for. The irony of being saved in the city you bombed. They took him to a military hospital, Bremen, the same city he had flown over as a target. The same place the briefing room map had turned into a red circle. Now he entered it not as a bomber crewman, but as a casualty of physics and war. German doctors examined him and shook their heads. His injuries were catastrophic. Head trauma, fractures, internal damage, the kind of medical list that usually ends with a chalk tag on a toe. But Eugene refused to die, or maybe death refused to take him. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and when he slept, he fell again, always falling, always spinning, always seeing the ground rise and not being able to change it. The two prisoner doctors stayed nearby as long as they were allowed, insisting on updates, insisting he be monitored, insisting he not be dismissed as a lost cause. In war, you learn an ugly truth. Enemies can still be human. And sometimes the only reason you survive is because someone, somewhere, decides your life is worth the trouble. Days passed. Eugene stabilized. Not healed, stabilized. The kind of stability that means you're alive enough to become useful. And that's when the visitors changed. Not doctors, not nurses, intelligence officers. Men who didn't care that his ribs screamed when he breathed, or that his head throbbed under bandages. They cared about information, bombing targets, formation tactics, radio frequencies, altitudes, escort schedules. They leaned close. They asked. They offered. They threatened. Eugene Moran, 19 years old, barely able to lift his arms, gave them the only things he was required to give. His name, his rank, his serial number, nothing more. And in that decision, quiet, stubborn, almost automatic, another part of his survival story began. Because surviving the fall was only the first impossible thing. Now he had to survive what came after. And what came after was a long road through the machinery of captivity. Through camps, interrogations, cold barracks, hunger, and eventually a march through winter that would test every ounce of will he had left. But for now, in the hospital bed in Bremen, Eugene stared at the ceiling and listened to German voices beyond the door. He didn't know where his crew was. He didn't know if anyone else had lived. He didn't know if the war would swallow him the way it swallowed so many others. He only knew this. He had fallen from the sky in a severed tail section, and he had landed in the one country on Earth that did not want him alive. Eugene Moran didn't become a prisoner in a dramatic moment with marching bands and raised flags. He became a prisoner the way most men do, quietly, in a hospital bed, with bandages around his head, splints on his arms, and pain that made time feel thick. German intelligence officers came in pairs. They wore clean uniforms and practiced expressions. Professional, almost polite, the way a banker might look at you before repossessing your house. One of them placed a folder on the edge of Moran's bed and opened it like this was a business meeting. Name. Moran swallowed. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran. Unit, 96th Bomb Group. Targets. Moran's eyes remained on the ceiling. Rank, name, serial number. The officer smiled as if he'd heard a child recite a lesson. He tried again. You are injured. We can help you. Better food, better medicine. Moran's head throbbed. His ribs felt like broken glass when he breathed. His arms were strapped and useless. He still said nothing. Radio frequencies. The officer pressed. Bombing altitudes, escort schedule. Moran turned his eyes slightly, just enough to acknowledge the man existed. Rank, name, serial number. It went on like that for days. Threats that didn't quite become violence. Promises that didn't quite become kindness. Long silences meant to break the human brain the way cold breaks an engine. But Moran was a farm boy. He'd grown up in a world where stubbornness was a survival trait, where you finished the job because the job didn't care if you felt like finishing it. And in that bed, he clung to a simple rule because it was all he had left. Give them nothing. Eventually, they stopped asking. Not because they stopped wanting. Because the war had 1,000 other mouths to feed and Moran was no longer a priority. He was a broken tail gunner who had somehow survived physics. Now he was just inventory, and inventory gets shipped. On December 14, 1943, guards loaded him into the back of a truck with other captured airmen. Moran sat among them, swaying with each bump of the road. His arms were still in makeshift splints, his head wound crusted, infection whispering at the edges of his skin. Every jolt sent pain up his ribs into his throat. Across from him sat a young bombarder with hollow cheeks and the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd watched his own airplane burn. The bombardier glanced at Moran's twisted arms and nodded toward his bandaged head. What happened to you? Moran tried to laugh. It became a cough. Fell. The bombardier blinked. You fell, what, out of a truck? Moran's eyes drifted toward the slats of the truck bed, where gray winter sky slid past. Out of the sky, he said. The bombardier studied him like he was deciding whether to believe a ghost story. You mean you bailed out? Moran hesitated. Then he said the words that still sounded impossible even inside his own mouth. No parachute. Silence settled over the truck, heavy as blankets. Somebody in the back muttered, Jesus. And another man whispered, they're gonna write books about that one. Moran didn't answer. He wasn't thinking about books. He was thinking about his crew and the empty silence where their voices used to be. He was thinking about the tail section spinning. He was thinking about the forest rising. And he was thinking about the new truth that had replaced everything else. Surviving the fall didn't mean you were safe. It just meant the war had found a new way to hurt you. They arrived at Stalag Luftthrow on December 17, 1943. A camp built for airmen. A prison with rules, routines, and a strange kind of order that made it feel almost civilized. until you remembered barbed wire was still barbed wire. The camp held thousands of Allied airmen in wooden barracks arranged like military blocks. Guard towers rose over them like watchful teeth. Searchlights swept at night, slow and steady, as if boredom itself had become a weapon. At the gate, guards took what little each man had left: dog tags, rings, watches, photos, the last scraps of being a person. Inside, Moran was assigned a bunk in a room with 31 other men. A coal stove sat in the center like a cruel joke because coal rations were minimal. The air smelled of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and thin soup. It was winter, and the cold was a living thing. It crawled into the cracks of the barracks. It settled into the boards under your feet. It invaded your lungs with every breath. Moran's arms healed wrong. There was no proper setting, no surgery, no time for careful rehabilitation. Bones fused at angles they weren't meant to hold. Tendons tightened like ropes in bad knots. He could move his fingers. He could make a fist. But when he tried to lift a spoon, his forearms rotated in a way that made men wince. Simple tasks became humiliations: buttoning a shirt, tying boots, washing his face. And in a camp where pride was one of the few things you still owned, humiliation could kill you faster than hunger. But the other prisoners did something that German doctrine did not account for. They made room for him. A lanky British pilot named Collins, everyone just called him Cole, started sitting beside Moran at meals and quietly sliding extra bits of bread his way. A Canadian navigator with hands like a mechanic offered to lace Moran's boots every morning without a word. A Texan gunner, older than Moran by just a few years, but somehow already ancient, leaned over once and said, "You keep breathing, kid. That's the job." The Germans expected prisoners to fracture into weak pieces. They were all wrong, because airmen did what airmen always did. They formed a crew. If you want to understand Stalag Luft the Third, you have to understand the radio. There was a secret receiver in the camp, assembled slowly over months. Parts smuggled in, pieces stolen, wire scavenged from anything that could be dismantled without being noticed. It was hidden inside a false wall in one of the barracks. And every night, selected men listened to the BBC. Not loudly, not proudly. Like thieves. They'd huddle close, ear pressed to the set, and the news would crackle through in a voice that felt like home. Bombing raids intensifying. Berlin struck again. Italy, the Eastern Front. Then, later, Normandy. Each broadcast carried hope, but it also carried a terrible math. Because every success meant more bombers, and more bombers meant more prisoners arriving. New men with fresh bruises, new burns, new stories. The camp was an archive of falling. Moran listened when he could, but at night, the real broadcast was inside his head. The spinning tail, the altimeter dropping, the forest reaching up. He'd wake drenched in sweat, lungs trying to remember how to breathe, hands clenched like they were still on the gun grips. And in the darkness of the barracks, Collins would whisper from the bunk above him, "Hey, farm boy, you're here." Moran would blink into the black. Collins would add softly, "You're not falling." And sometimes, that was enough. In March 1944, the camp changed. Because the prisoners did what prisoners always do when you put enough pilots in one place. They tried to leave. They had been digging a tunnel for over a year. 30 feet down, hundreds of feet long. Dirt hidden in gardens, spread in yards, dumped under floorboards, carried in improvised penguins. Bags sewn into trouser legs. The tunnel had a name: Harry. When the night came, men slipped through it one by one, emerging into the forest beyond the wire. 76 escaped. For a few hours, the camp breathed like a free thing. Then, at dawn, the Germans discovered the tunnel. What followed wasn't just a manhunt. It was a warning to the world. The Nazis mobilized tens of thousands of troops, police, and even Hitler Youth to hunt the escapees down. Within weeks, most were recaptured. And then 50 of them were executed. Not in one place, not quickly, not clean. Individually, in different locations, shot while trying to escape. The paperwork would say. The paperwork was a lie. Everyone knew it. When the surviving escapees were returned, the camp watched them walk back through the gate, thinner and quieter and somehow older than the men who'd left. The Germans posted names. A list, 50. The barracks went silent when men read it. It's hard to describe what silence means in a camp full of thousands of prisoners. It wasn't peace. It was a collective understanding. The enemy had removed the mask. From that moment on, the camp had a new gravity. Roll calls increased, searches intensified, movement restricted. The Germans weren't just guarding prisoners anymore. They were guarding fear. Moran watched it from his bunk, his arms slowly regaining strength, his body learning a new kind of endurance. He had survived the sky. Now he had to survive time. June 6, 1944. The radio crackled with two words that sounded like a myth. Allied landings. Men who had been starving for a sign of forward motion began to smile again. Quietly. Carefully. Because joy in a camp could turn into punishment. But that night, whispers traveled from bunk to bunk like electricity. "We're coming. They're on the beaches. It's starting." Moran lay on his back and stared at the ceiling boards. He imagined France. He imagined soldiers pushing inland. He imagined a future. Then he remembered Bremen. He remembered flak, and he understood the cruel truth of war. Even when liberation begins, it still takes a long time to reach you. Months passed. Summer became autumn. Autumn became another winter. The war news grew darker and brighter at the same time. Germany was bleeding, but Germany was still dangerous. Moran's feet always hurt now. Not from the fall. Those pains had become familiar. The feet hurt because the cold was constant and the barracks floor was unforgiving. One night, a man new to the camp asked Moran quietly, "How'd you survive it?" Moran didn't answer right away. Then he said the only honest thing. "I didn't, not really. I just kept going." The man frowned. "That's not an answer." Moran looked at him, eyes flat. "It's the only one I have." On January 27th, 1945, German guards ordered the camp to evacuate. The Soviets were coming. This was the point in the war when Germany was collapsing inward like a burning building, and the guards were suddenly afraid, not of prisoners, but of being caught between fronts. At 4 a.m., in a blizzard, 10,000 prisoners formed columns outside the camp. Each man carried one blanket, whatever food he could scavenge, and the weight of his own bones. The guards said they were marching west. They did not say how far. They did not say where. They said anyone who fell behind would be shot. Moran stood in line, blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His arms ached. His ribs ached. His feet ached. But he was alive. And alive meant walking. The column moved out at dawn, disappearing into white. The death march had begun. The first man died on the second day. He didn't fall dramatically. He just stopped. An American bombardier from Ohio, skinny, coughing, eyes too bright, sat down in the snow like he was tired and decided to rest. A guard shouted. The bombardier didn't move. Two other prisoners tried to pull him up. The guard raised his rifle. The men backed away, and the bombardier became a dark shape against the white landscape. The column kept moving. That's what a death march is. Not constant gunfire. Not mass executions every hour. It's the relentless truth that the road does not stop for you. By the third day, 4 more men were dead. By the end of the first week, bodies dotted the roadside like mile markers. The prisoners walked 12 hours a day, 10-minute breaks every 2 hours. At night, they were herded into barns, churches, any structure that could hold bodies, sometimes into open fields when no shelter appeared. The temperature dropped below 0 and kept dropping. Snow fell like it had been ordered to. Hunger became the only thought. Men ate snow for water. They chewed bark. They fought rats in barns and argued over whether rat meat tasted like anything other than survival. Some traded watches, rings, anything to German civilians for bread. Most had nothing left to trade. Moran's feet blistered after the first week. Then the blisters burst. Then infection set in. He could feel fluid squishing in his boots with every step, and the pain became so constant it stopped being pain and became a new layer of reality. He thought about stopping, not in a dramatic, suicidal way, just in the exhausted way of a body that begins to negotiate. If I sit down for 1 minute, if I close my eyes for 10 seconds, but he had already learned something in the tail section. Stopping doesn't pause the fall. It just changes how you hit. So he walked, one foot, then the other. And when his legs tried to quit, he used the only fuel left. Memory. Wisconsin fields, his mother's kitchen, the smell of hay, the sound of a barn door closing in summer. He did not think about heroism. He thought about home. As February turned the world into ice, the guards grew more nervous. Soviet artillery rumbled somewhere behind them. A distant thunder. American bombers flew overhead heading east, black crosses of friendly violence. Sometimes prisoners looked up and cheered. Sometimes guards looked up and flinched. Because by then, everyone knew Germany was losing. The guards weren't guarding prisoners anymore. They were guarding their own futures. A few prisoners tried to escape. Most failed. Near a patch of woods, 3 men ran. They didn't get far. The guards shot them and left the bodies where they fell as a warning. Some prisoners gave up in a different way. They sat down in the snow and refused to move. Guards shot them too. Not because it made sense. Because the march was built on fear, and fear needs examples. Moran watched all of it with a kind of distant numbness, like his brain had put itself behind glass. He was past shock, past outrage. He was in the simple arithmetic of survival, move or die. After weeks of walking, after the landscape blurred into a single endless corridor of snow and exhaustion, the column reached a town, Bitterfeld. The guards herded the prisoners into an old factory building. Temporary, they said. Transportation will come, they said. Soon. Soon is the favorite lie of every captor. The prisoners collapsed onto the concrete floor. Men who had marched for weeks could no longer stand. Some simply fell and didn't rise again. Moran tried to pull off his boots. They wouldn't come. His feet were swollen so badly the leather might as well have been glued to skin. Inside the factory, winter lived in the walls. The air smelled of rust, old oil, and sickness. Days passed, then weeks. The guards brought almost no food. Men survived on scraps they found, moldy grain, random bits of potato, anything. Rats became targets. Men caught them with hands that barely worked and roasted them over little fires that barely warmed the air. Grass and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete became meals. Dysentery spread. Men too weak to stand soiled themselves where they lay. The stench became a blanket you couldn't throw off. Guards stayed outside more and more, as if the misery inside might contaminate them. Moran's weight dropped below 100 pounds. His cheeks hollowed. His eyes sank. His feet oozed with infection. He could feel his body shutting down, not quickly, but patiently, like a machine being turned off one switch at a time. At night, he drifted into a half-sleep where he fell again, always falling, always spinning, always hearing the wind. One day, he woke to a new sound, artillery. Close, not distant thunder. Close, American artillery. The sound grew louder each day, and with it the guards' panic grew sharper. They held hurried conversations. Some vanished during the night. The prisoners lay on the floor listening to the war approaching like footsteps. On April 11, 1945, at about 2 p.m., the factory doors opened. Not politely. They were kicked in. American soldiers entered, rifles up, eyes scanning for threats, and then stopped as if they'd walked into the mouth of hell. Hundreds of skeletal men lay on the floor. The smell hit the soldiers like a wall. Some backed out and vomited. A medic stepped forward first, because medics are the kind of people who keep walking toward the worst thing in the room. He moved from man to man, checking pulses, lifting eyelids, speaking softly. When he reached Moran, the medic paused. He looked down at this broken farm boy, now a skeleton wrapped in a blanket, and shook his head as if to say, "How are you still here?" Moran tried to speak. His throat produced a rasp. The medic leaned closer. Moran whispered one word, the only word he could find that meant everything. "Home?" The medic swallowed hard. "You're home enough," he said, "and you're going to make it the rest of the way." Stretchers arrived. Men were carried out into daylight like relics pulled from a ruin. Ambulances waited. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness, but he remembered flashes. American uniforms, the sound of English, a flag patch on a shoulder. The feeling, finally, of the war moving away from him. In a field hospital 15 miles west, Army doctors worked through the night treating freed prisoners. They cut away Moran's boots. His feet were blackened with necrosis and infection. For a moment, amputation hovered in the room like a quiet threat. They tried to save them. They pumped him full of antibiotics, sulfur drugs, whatever they had. They cleaned wounds. They gave plasma. They warmed him slowly because even warmth can kill you when your body is starved. Moran's body stabilized again. The same word as Bremen, the same meaning, not healed, but not dying today. He was transferred to a larger hospital, then to France. Recovery took months. Weight came back in cautious increments. 1 pound, then another. His arms regained function, though they remained slightly twisted. Permanent souvenirs of a year without proper care. He learned to walk without collapsing. He learned to breathe without coughing up pain. And at night, he learned something harder. He learned the war wasn't finished with him just because the guns had stopped. On July 11, 1945, the Statue of Liberty rose out of the water like something from a dream. Moran stood on the deck of a hospital ship, wind in his face, eyes burning. He had been gone for years, but it felt like he had lived 3 lifetimes, 5 combat missions, a fall from the sky inside a severed tail section, 17 months as a prisoner, a winter march, a factory full of dying men. Now New York Harbor. Crowds cheered from behind barriers. Someone played the national anthem over loudspeakers. Moran couldn't stop crying, not because he was weak, because the human body can only hold so much pain before it demands release. He stepped onto the pier like a man stepping onto a new planet. They processed him through Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, medical examinations, paperwork, questions, more paperwork. Doctors documented every injury, every scar, every limitation. They recommended months more treatment. Moran refused. He wanted home. He wanted Wisconsin. He wanted the farm. He wanted something that wasn't a fence or a guard tower or a hospital smell. When he got off the bus in Soldiers Grove, his mother didn't recognize him at first. That's what war does. It steals a face and replaces it with a stranger. Then she realized, and she collapsed. Neighbors came. They asked questions. Some were kind. Some were curious in the way people are when they've been safe and want to touch danger without paying the cost. What was it like? Were they cruel? Did you kill anyone? How did you survive the fall? Moran answered some he couldn't. Because language has limits, and some memories don't fit in sentences. He returned to work on the farm, then construction jobs, a life built in the practical way a farm boy understands. You do what needs doing. He married. He raised children. He rarely talked about the war unless asked directly. He didn't wear his story like a badge. He carried it like weight. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world was safe, he would wake up and hear the wind again. Decades passed. History moved on. Then, late in life, someone wrote a local article. A short piece. A headline that sounded like a tall tale. Local veteran survived impossible fall. A historian read it and didn't laugh. He drove to Wisconsin. He sat at Moran's table. He listened, and Moran, old now, hands still bearing the crooked angles of long-healed bones, told the story carefully, like he was laying out tools on a workbench. The mission briefing, the fighters, the flak, the moment the intercom died, the severed tail, the spinning glide, the trees, the Serbian prisoner doctors, the hospital, the interrogations, Stalag Luftretz, the tunnel, the list of 50 names, the march, the factory, the doors opening. He told it without drama, and that made it worse, because drama is how we protect ourselves. Truth, spoken plainly, has no padding. The historian searched records, compared reports, traveled to Germany, found witnesses, found the impact site in the woods, found fragments still buried. Eventually, years later, a memorial went up where the tail section had come down. Names carved, a place made permanent. Here's the question people ask, the one that turns the whole story into a debate. Why did he keep firing? Why not curl up, brace for impact, conserve strength? Pray, why shoot at fighters when you're already falling 4 miles toward the ground? You can imagine answers. Anger, revenge, training, stubbornness. But the real answer might be simpler and more human, because the guns were the last thing that made him feel like he wasn't already dead. When your parachute is shredded and the hatch is jammed and the altimeter is counting down your remaining life, doing your job might be the only way to keep your mind from shattering. He wasn't trying to win a dogfight. He was trying to stay himself. And in a war designed to reduce men into smoke and paperwork, that might be the most defiant act of all. They were all wrong, because Eugene Moran didn't just survive the fall. He survived what the fall tried to do to his mind. If you're still here, you're the kind of person this channel is made for. So, quick favor, hit like if you want more true or nearly true survival stories that spark real debate, and subscribe if you want a new WWII impossible story every week. And tell me in the comments, if you were Moran, no parachute, locked in a falling tail, do you keep firing, or do you give up and brace for impact? All right, back to the end of Moran's story. Moran lived a long life. Long enough to become the kind of old man people underestimate. Long enough to watch the world change beyond recognition. Long enough to see his story return from silence into memory. And if you want the final irony, the one history loves, here it is. The day he fell, the world tried to erase him. Flak tried. Gravity tried. Cold tried. Starvation tried. A factory floor tried. He outlasted all of it. Not because he was superhuman, but because somewhere inside that 19-year-old farm boy, a decision formed that never left him. Not today. And that's what makes the story uncomfortable. Because it forces a question none of us can answer until we're tested. How much can a human endure before they become something else? Eugene Moran endured enough to fall 4 miles. Enough to live through captivity. Enough to walk through winter. Enough to come home and build a life. And for the rest of us, sitting safely decades later, his story leaves a final image in the mind. A severed tail section spinning through the sky over Germany, and a line of tracers reaching out from it, proving to the enemy, to the earth below, and maybe to fate itself, that somebody was still alive in there.